First, I want to welcome you all here. Thank you for joining us tonight here. I want to give big thanks and a round of applause to Corgan. So I'm also instructed to give a big round. There we go. Really appreciate this space, their great work in Dallas and beyond, and providing an opportunity for us to engage with you all, with our speakers. I want to thank David and our team on the events committee. David heads up our events committee. It's their work that made this happen tonight. So a lot's going on here in Dallas and statewide in regard to zoning reform, land use reform. We have a handout that's an article. I was fortunate enough to be asked to speak with national CNU and our national publication, which sort of details some of what we are going through. There are a lot of exceptional positives. There are perhaps unintended downsides. And the fact is, we don't all have to agree. Some things some of us may prefer to see happen, and some things some of us may prefer not to see happen. But the reality is change is the only constant, and we are at a time of great change. So what we're going to do is I'm first going to just quickly introduce our panelists, give about a 1 to 2 minute rundown of some of the legislation that we're going to talk about. Again, you can learn more on the handout, and then the show's really about our panelists here tonight. We have public sector, private sector, folks working with communities and engineering for the future in fiscally responsible ways, and folks that are doing the actual on-the-ground development. So we have that full range of perspectives. So we have Monty Anderson, developer, principal of Options Real Estate, former past president of CNU North Texas. Next to him is Patrick Kennedy. Patrick, are you a former president?
Correct.
So we've got two former presidents. Patrick's a renowned principal of the human ecosystem, renowned urbanist and urban strategist, member of the DART board. We then have Emily Liu, future president of the CNU North Texas. This is how you get drafted. We're really fortunate to have the director of planning and development from the city of Dallas. A lot of reform, from parking reform to their ongoing zoning reform now is underway. And then Kevin Shepard, founder and owner of Verdunity, who's working with these communities to try to create more optimized plans, engineering and infrastructure strategies that are more in tune with fiscal reality and benefiting the communities in which they work. So I am Brandon Palanker, your moderator. You won't have to hear much from me hopefully soon. We'll take off with our panelists here, and we want this to be engaging. You know, I'll start this off with a couple of questions, but if you all have questions from the audience, please, we have someone with a mic that will be able to go to you. We want to have this as sort of a two-way conversation. And some of the highlights of the legislation we're talking about, and probably the most talked about, is Senate Bill 840. The long and short of it is in larger cities of 150,000 people in a county of over 300,000, so certainly Dallas and Fort Worth, but Frisco and Plano, those larger cities. What this allows is, as of right, on land that is zoned commercial or retail, you can now do multifamily and mixed use with multifamily. The general idea is it's at least 35 units per acre, at least 45 feet. You can go significantly up from there. A lot of benefits here in terms of easing the ability to get housing. When you have more housing, you positively affect the affordability challenge. But there are some potential downsides and some concerns of cities and communities alike. Senate Bill 2477, which deals with converting office space to multifamily. There's the great single stairway bill, which allows for single stairway and single access to decrease footprint, decrease cost of construction for up to 6 stories. And then in the city of Dallas, you have the opportunity for up to 8 units under the residential building code. You have parking reform that is already proved. It is the law of our land here, and the parking minimums being either reduced or in some cases not necessary at all will really help affordability, will allow for smaller and mid-sized businesses to be more competitive, create more walkable environments. And finally, Dallas Forward 2.0, the comprehensive plan that has been adopted that is leading to what we're seeing now, ongoing zoning reform. And Emily certainly can espouse on that more than I can, but a lot of great work And I also want to do a shout out to Brian Toney with Dallas Housing Coalition, working with communities around our area to help educate them as to understanding what zoning is and the implications of the ongoing reform. So with that, why don't we start with Monty, and then we'll come this way. Just, what are some of your thoughts in terms of the legislation, whether it's at the state level, whether it's the city of Dallas? How is that going to impact those of us in this room from a professional perspective, and certainly the neighborhoods in which we live?
Well, for me, I don't pay much attention to all that. I just already do what I can with what I got. And that's kind of the way it is with an incremental developer, but it's got to have a big impact. I mean, the parking reforms had just huge. For instance, at one of my projects, Tyler Station, we had this complicated parking chart that was so bad, that every time you got a new tenant and a CO, you had to go through this just long, thing of getting. Now we don't have to have it. I mean, we're next to a DART station. It's zoned industrial. We have to have zero parking. So, the fire code for the 8 units and below, having to have a fire sprinkler system, that kills a deal. I mean, you can't do those deals. I think it's got to have a huge impact. That just all of this stuff is going to have, major impacts on the cost. And cost today, some people have said inflation's been up, it's gone up 30% or 40%. I say it's gone up 100%. Anybody building right now? I say it's 100%. That's what it's costing me. And so, those numbers don't work. And so we're going to have to figure out, we're going to have to cut things up smaller. We're going to have to do with less. We're going to have to start with the end in mind. In fact, when you start, you got to work on the money first, and then doing good is equal. You balance it with that, but you got to start with the money. You got to start with the money. Don't go out and do drawings. Don't go out and do this stuff until you got the money worked out. And I think that's the biggest impacts. We're like California used to be now. You say like $300-400 a square foot, $500. That was like unseen for us, and now that's us.
And Patrick, you sort of said at that confluence of public sector, private sector, development strategies, infrastructure, certainly your role with DART. From that perspective, what do you see this in terms of cost and also process, and how that's going to affect our industry and our neighborhoods?
Well, let me tell you a little story. And I think it's where SB 840 is really interesting and ironic to me, in that in 2016, City of Plano passed a comprehensive plan where they said, hey, we are out of land. We're not going to be able to grow anymore. If we can't grow, we can't afford the next generation of infrastructure, so we have to grow inward, and the best opportunity to grow inward is all of their four-corner strip center retail, basically single-story commercial properties, right? And they said, okay, we have to turn those into mixed-use villages, basically. And all of their city council got recalled because of that. And SB 840 just said, now you can do that. Now, at the same time, being on the dartboard, we're dealing with some issues with some of our member cities. And
We've heard.
And they're like, hey, how do we get revenue? Because we're paying so much money to DART, while we've got a $2 billion rail line that's under construction and will be financed for the next 30 years, going to Plano from DFW Airport. And I just think that's interesting at the same time that they have raised property taxes this year, and they passed a $630 million bond, which would be the equivalent of the city of Dallas having a $3.5 billion bond, right? We normally do like $1 to $1.5 billion bonds in Dallas every 5 or so years. But that's just a huge number, right? And I think, I don't have to step on Kevin's toes, but more sort of lead it into him, is that the legislature was thinking of this as a housing affordability approach. Say, hey, we want to sort of unrestrict supply side, allow more supply of housing, and in a smart way. That has to be infill, essentially, because it has to be 150,000 people in a county of 300,000 people. And so, yes, that's good. It could almost be entirely rental, right, if we're not careful, so it doesn't really enable people entering into home ownership, so it doesn't help on that side really at all, but it can help deliver supply. But I think it's just kind of fascinating in that ultimately, all of our cities, and I think Monty would say this too, is that all of our cities are effectively broke because we have far too much infrastructure deficit, too many roads, too many big roads, and not enough tax base to actually support them. And so it's not like we all go, all the cities file chapter 11 and go broke. It's that they just have to cut here and there. It's just this endless sort of deficit spending just to make things slightly less worse. And I think that's kind of the bigger narrative here, is that this is a starting point, not a finishing point. The parking code reform is a starting point. It's not the finishing point. And we have a chance to say, how do we, take what's happened at the city and the state level and then make them all better and keep going forward.
Appreciate that. So Emily, before we get your thoughts on things that are happening both within your city and under your purview and elsewhere, maybe this is right, you have the mic, so why don't you give a little bit more detail of what exactly is happening at the city, because it's a lot and it ties in with things that are happening elsewhere, but I think there's a lot of opportunity and excitement from those of us in the development industry and those that work with communities. So give us a little insight.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned the city is more like my department, so I start with there.
Okay.
So I started about a year and a half ago, City of Dallas, as the planning director. And within about a month, two departments merged. I started with planning urban design, and then there's development services, planning urban design, do long-range planning, current planning, historic preservation, urban design, all of that. The development service is mostly related to permitting, and there's a lot of silos. So one of the reasons got to combine is to break down the silos so we can start talking to each other and work as a team. It's been very successful. I want to report back to you. It's not easy. It looks easy, but it's not. And so right now we are a combined department called planning and development. So in addition to planning, urban design, current planning, we're also dealing with all kinds of permitting issues, commercial, residential, inspections, all of that is in this department. So I'm so glad to hear one of our developers saying everything seemed to work well. That's really meant a lot to me, like the parking reform, all the things that you experience at SB 840, all of that actually will help, but I think also important by combining the two departments, we really improved efficiency, we improved a collaboration and deliver better services to the citizens of Dallas.
That's great, and maybe if you could just provide where we are in the process, right? We've done parking reform 2.0.
Wow.
Where are we now and what's next?
It's so much going on just within a short year and a half, I cannot believe. So when I first started, a lot of these projects were already in the work before I started. So 2024 in the fall, I'm going to start with Dallas, Forward Dallas, because that's the first project that gone through the process. It's ready in the process for almost 3 years. It was at the finish line, trying to get it adopted. It's a lot of work, and I have to say, some of you are here. I saw Brian here. I saw there's a lot of you, Greater Dallas Planning Council, the Housing Coalition, AIA, a lot of organizations really help. I don't know about CNU, I'm pretty sure you are involved too, and a lot of involvement. So eventually got adopted. So that's a huge, because Forward Dallas is the comprehensive plan for the city, is a policy, a recommendation, a guide for future growth. So that set the framework for everything else. So I'm so glad that got done first. And the day after that, we started the zoning reform. Zoning is implementation of that. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then the parking reform, I have Michael Wade here, who's been working on this for a little bit. And Dr. Andrea Udria, you probably, all of you knows about her. She's been working on this for 5 years. And finally, this past May, only a few months ago, the parking reform passed. It's tremendous. We are one of the largest cities have gone this far, actually. It's unbelievable. Basically, we already talked about anything within transit, within half a mile of a DART station or even a streetcar station, no parking minimum. Middle housing from 3 to 20 units, no parking minimum. Historic building of any kind, no parking minimum. Office, retail, it is like quite a few of the uses, no parking. I think one of the benefit about the parking reform is not just like you don't require like the market and the user dictate, but also reduces the review time. I talked to one of reviewer. I said, how much time did you spend on this calculate parking reform? Used to be the parking is based on like apartment, like per bedroom, 1 unit per bedroom does not make a lot of sense. And they said they spend about 50% of their time just calculate the parking. Right now, a lot of them no longer require, so free up a lot of their time. So that's tremendous. I'll briefly talk about 1 to 8 units. And I have to say, that is really something the city council has really championed on that. When I first started, my first meeting was Councilman West, give me a list. And on top of the list is this building code reform, allowing, I think at the time we were only talking about like 4 units, so that would be great if we can allow up to 4 units. But anyway, I've been done zoning reform, parking reform before in my career. I've never done like building code reform, but I've been involved nationally about removing barrier for housing, the Housing Supply Accelerator. I was serving at the national committee, and I realized that just zoning reform, parking reform itself would not solve all the problem. It's just one piece of the puzzle. You have so many other barriers, and building code is absolutely one of them. So I was very excited because I'm going to have the opportunity to work on that. He told me the previous staff is just not interested, but I said, I am interested. So working with our staff, especially with our fire department, and also the ILS outside, the AIA. I know Brian's there, again, a lot of organizations from outside really help. It only took like 4 months. We got it done. Later on, people called and say, this is tremendous. You are the first city ever gone to 8 units. Do you know that? I was blown away at the impact we have been doing. So those are just amazing work. And Dallas zoning reform, I think I can talk about that a little later.
That sounds great.
But I talk already a lot.
No, and as we hand off to Kevin, I want to say thank you, for just having the insight and being forward thinking. And while we likely agree on a lot, doesn't mean we'll agree on everything. The fact that we see things happening is the first step, and I think that's important. And one thing that I appreciate about parking reform, and Monty, I don't want to speak for you, would probably agree, is let the market dictate. Like, we know our businesses. I mean, you might say we only need, half a spot per unit. But if we're building a type of product and we know we're going to need 1 or 1.5, we'd be foolish not to build that. But let the market decide that. I think that's great. And when we talk about market and fiscal responsibility, Kevin, you work in communities and with municipalities across the state and across the country. What is your take on this? How will these changes in code, in zoning and land use regulation, how is that from your perspective beneficial? And what might need to be some next steps to look at the larger picture in terms of urban design, urban planning, transportation, mobility, infrastructure, and tie that in?
That was a lot. So I'm going to zoom out and just talk about the why, right? I'm an engineer by degree. I spent the first 17 years of my career doing different kinds of municipal infrastructure, highway infrastructure, that kind of stuff. Shifted into 2008, 2009. Served as national director of my former firm's community planning practice, and as I was doing that, I'm traveling all over the country, and I started to see that no matter where I went, big city, small city, rural, urban, suburban, nobody had the money to fix their infrastructure. And I'm like, why are we in the most prosperous country on the planet and we can't pay the bills in our cities? That was kind of the aha moment that led me to start Verdunity back in 2011. And I would just ask you this, everybody deserves, or we say everybody deserves to live in a prosperous community at a price they can afford, right? We want to build lasting, inclusive, equitable, affordable places. The reality is that we're building cities that we can't afford to live in as residents, and we can't afford to maintain them as cities, right? And so we can get into all of this middle stuff of what infrastructure we're designing, what housing are we building, how many stories, and all of those things. The reality is our cities are struggling to pay for all of the infrastructure and the parks and the facilities, all the things that were built over the last 60, 70 years. And from the housing side, when you build it, most of your housing in a lower density, spread out, sprawling kind of pattern, you're requiring more infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, everything else. You're lowering the density of that pattern, and so you have more costs and fewer households and people to pay for it. And so that low density pattern, we'll probably talk more tonight about the housing aspect of it. If we need more density, we need more supply, so we've got to put it in all shapes and sizes to close the gap. I would bring it back to the way that we close our gaps for cities. It's not about the tax rate per se, it's about building the right density. It doesn't have to be crazy density, but build enough density with different shapes and sizes of homes that gets that taxable value up without overburdening any individual taxpayer. So we're playing all kinds of games at the Texas legislature. There's other states that have been through this before, the property tax cap bills, all those kind of things. But at the end of the day, if we want to build places that we can afford to serve and maintain as cities and that we can afford to live in as residents, we have to get more dense. We have to go back, build more density in the core, maximize the development that we have without building more infrastructure. Maybe we can do it in a more walkable, mixed-use way that takes advantage of transit so that we don't need more, as wide and as many lanes. But we just need a big shift in this country with the way that we're living and think about development. And we have so much conversation about the policies and individual bills and all of that stuff. And at the end of the day, if I could go to our governor tomorrow or the other night when he did his new, running again, I would just want to ask him, how are we going to pay for this? That's the question I always ask of every city council, every resident. You can want whatever you want, but how are we going to pay for it as the city, and how are you going to pay for it as a resident? Right now, there's a huge disconnect.
When you say that, I recall you used the phrase fiscal resource and affordability gap. Is that sort of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I'd like to say there's a resource gap in cities that they have more to serve and maintain than they have revenue coming in. And then obviously there's the affordability gap for residents too. And I'll also use the phrase cultivate fiscal health and local wealth. To Monty's point, you're not going to get out of this too by building a bunch of more expensive properties that more of your residents can't pay for, right? You've got to also raise the wealth of the people so that they can afford more over time. We do work in a lot of different communities, and some of them are more affluent places, and their answer is, we don't want the low density, we don't want density, we don't want the smaller affordable stuff. We're totally fine with $500,000 homes or $800,000 homes and low density stuff. That's fine, that can be you, just don't put it on your website that you're gonna be an affordable, inclusive place, because you're not, right? Just own who you are. But most places have got to add some density and have got to add some more affordable products and are gonna have to get more mixed use type development in different contexts. And so they kind of end my intro with, I do think these are good bills and they are just a step. I think cities like Dallas are doing some amazing things to chip away at it, but even in Dallas, I think this bigger conversation of building a lasting and affordable place sometimes gets lost in the minutia a little bit. So we got to get back to cultivating places that our cities can maintain and people can afford to live in.
Right, and when you're talking about that, right, that sort of fiscal gap, and I want to go to you, Patrick. You had mentioned that, right, we need the tax base to support the stuff that we need to either get around or the services that provide that quality of life. But you said, but that's just the starting point in terms of where we are today. What do you see as the finishing point in terms of what are the outcomes that we want to see, the types of housing, types of development at the end of the day, and maybe what are some other steps along the way to build on some of this legislative change and reform to get there?
Sure. One is on the parking reform. Minneapolis, I think last year, went to full parking repeal of off-street parking requirements. They started in 2017, I think, with something much closer to what we have started with, which is repeal under a certain amount of units within a certain distance of rail transit. I think they included a high-frequency bus, which we weren't able to include, unfortunately. I would argue that if you add density along bus transit, that makes it more fixed than it would be because you're driving demand, but the city doesn't really like that. Either way. So my point on parking is once we can prove that it's not the end of the world, that somebody can provide, X minus 2 parking spaces rather than the previously demanded one, and it's not going to be the end of the world. In fact, we might be driving more demand into on-street spaces, which is a good thing because that's a potential revenue source for the city. Those are taxpayer-owned parking spaces that we're often giving away. So that's one further step. Another one that somewhat frustrated me because I was working with some of the lobbyists on SB 840 because they came to me and said, hey, what does Dallas need? And my whole thing is, okay, how do we flip the competitive advantage with the bleeding edge of sprawl, right? Far north Dallas, Salina, Prosper, wherever the hell, places I don't go. But that's where it's easier to build, right? And so if it's easier to build, people are to keep going out there. So how do we make it easier to build back in towards the city? Quick side note, a Wall Street Journal reporter called me up a couple of months ago and said, so what's it like being in Dallas with the 3 million, 4 million extra people there since you've been there? And I was like, Dallas hasn't changed that much in my 20 years. We've only added 100,000 people. Meanwhile, we've added 3 or 4 million people at that bleeding edge, right? We've tripled in size, I think, in geographic area, but only doubled in population. So it's not like Dallas is changing a lot. But I think that's what is the starting point here, is to say, how do we make it more attractive to invest and develop and build housing back in Dallas? And this is something I've tried to bring the other DART board members around on when it comes to some of our real estate holdings and development. It's we don't need retail. Because they think, well, retail is sales tax is revenue to the agency. I'm like, well, bricks and mortar retail doesn't actually generate sales tax just because you build it. It's the rooftops and people living there that pay money to services and retail that then pays to DART. And so what we need more than anything is more rooftops coming back into the city of Dallas and all of our member cities, which I think we've only been getting a single-digit % of the growth of that massive growth throughout the region. So from our standpoint, we can't add service until we add density. We can't make transportation more efficient and cheaper for everybody until we add density and things are closer together, right? So if we're at going over 30% of take-home income for housing and going over 20% for transportation, all of a sudden now there's not a whole lot, and this is gross income before taxes, but there's not a lot left. For a lot of people, especially when we're at 60,000 per household, whereas Plano's at 120,000. So fundamentally, transit needs density to make it more efficient. And then more people living here pays more sales tax, pays more revenue into the system, and we can then provide service to where people already are and not do the mistake that a lot of transit agencies do, which is build rail to where they hope people will come eventually. Look what Austin's first rail line did. It just built it to nowhere. And now eventually it's starting to come in, but it sits there in languages for a long time. So to me, it's just part of this holistic effort to reduce overall costs. To say, not only are we trying to build supply of housing to regulate the housing market, it's also about how do we have more things close to people with enough density to support transit to regulate the transportation costs on that side too, because you can't just talk about housing costs without transportation costs.
And not to be combative, because I generally agree with what you've said, but I will say that while perhaps as a whole our city may not have changed a lot, we do have some new great examples, right? When I moved here 10 years ago, which was right after, within a couple of years of Clyde Warren Park, right, in terms of the urban core and to see what that's done, and to see the sort of stitching together of uptown with Arts District with downtown. We see certain areas that have just become more walkable, more vibrant. And obviously we need to balance the issues of replacement and gentrification and things of that sort. But I think we have some examples here that we can build from so that we can do this, to your point, en masse, which we really need to move the needle. And in order to move the needle and to have that change that Patrick's talking about in truly a great scale, I'm going to sort of open this up to Monty, Kevin, and love to hear your thoughts of this. So we have this new landscape and these new laws. I know you've told me, Monty, just because you have new laws doesn't mean things necessarily change, and certainly not overnight. that we have cities that aren't ready for it yet and may need some help. So I would like to know your thought on that from the private perspective, yours, Kevin, from working with cities, and then Emily, and maybe this is your chance of how are you looking to address that so that the city of Dallas and our developers and neighborhoods are ready to take advantage?
I was just thinking, I work in a lot of the suburbs of the South, down in southern Dallas County, and they're always saying, if we just had this good restaurant to move down here, that would be it. And the thing is they're not going to move there until you get the density of people. So it's like what goes first. It's not the chicken and the egg. I mean, you got to have the people first before the cool restaurant's going to move down there. But if you want to get the restaurant down there, you might scale them down to 1,200 square feet where they would work. So you got to have the scale. Density for density's sake is not good. In fact, somebody called me the other day, and they were working on a 5,000 acre deal in between Midlothian and Mansfield, and they said, we want to talk to you about the missing middle down here. I said, missing middle and on a 5,000 acre development? What missing middle? What they were saying was, help us put density out here in the middle of nowhere. And the context is totally wrong. We got to fill in, the right things on top of these old suburban parking lots, like I'm doing in Duncanville right now. We're putting, townhomes for sale on a retail shopping center parking lot. Well, we don't have 150,000 people down there, so we had to have a PD, and it's taken me 2.5 years to get this permitted, which they gave me the zoning 2.5 years ago. So they still treated it like a green field. I said, we're just going to cut some paving out and put some units in. That's all we're going to do. And they treat it like a green field. So you can't treat things the same. What's happening right now with these cities is there's like Emily said, they're in silos working, and they're not coming together. You can't change. A city manager stays about 2.5 years anymore. And then the next thing, they fire everybody and they bring in new people. The zoning I told them the other day in front of economic development, I said, I've been here for 20-something years doing development here. None of you've even been here for over 5 years. And we're constantly having to teach and relearn again. And so the density and the scale, the size of the spaces, the size of the units, so we have good quality stuff. I'd rather have something, if you're in a poor area, you might have a 300 square foot unit, but good quality, So you still have good quality. If you're in a more affluent area, you have a bigger space. But everybody deserves that quality, that quality area. And I always like to go into a neighborhood and say, okay, what's the neighborhood? What can they afford here? And it's like, south of the zoo, it's a $750 neighborhood. Bishop Arts is a $2,000 neighborhood. Highland Park is a $5,000 neighborhood. And once I know what the price of the neighborhood is, then I can tell you how many square feet we can give you to make a development deal without subsidy. So once I know that figure, and so you've got to calibrate each neighborhood. If you start going in and putting odd things upon the earth with these incentive and LIHTC deals and all kinds of odd things, you create things that are just not going to be sustainable. So you've got to really pay attention to the scale and the nodes. We ought to have density in nodes, right? Not everywhere needs density. You have nodes, and then you have in the transect, in the CNU transect, you pay attention to that because there's a good reason for it, because it works, and it's good. It's not perfect because we're dealing with bad stuff built suburban wise. We're having to repair things, and so we're going to have to fix things that don't fit in any of these places.
So. The audience, are you familiar with the transect? You can certainly Google it for more detail, but the long and short of it is the CNU transect is the concept that you have your greatest density and height and therefore activity within the urban core. And then as you sort of get out, you go from, if it's a big city, from 40 and 60-story towers to maybe 10 and then 12-story, and then you go down to 4-story, and then you go down to sort of townhomes on the way down to sort of single-family home, and then nature. I mean, that's dumbing it down at the end of the day. But you can also look at this in a more sort of in a more rural downtown, where your main street might only have 2 stories or might only have 3 stories, but still has that greatest density, and then it sort of decreases from there.
It's amazing how one of my favorite urban cities in all the United States is South Beach, Florida, before they built the really tall stuff, because it's all 2 stories, no parking lots, small blocks, It's highly dense. 50,000 people live in a 1.5 square miles, and another 200,000 people come there every weekend to party. And it works, and nobody's got, they have very few cars, and it's one of the most perfect urban cities, I think, around.
That's great, and Kevin, your perspective, in terms of how, for the folks out here who work with cities or neighborhoods that want to sort of push them along, what lessons can be learned to break down some of those silos? And then would love to hear how that's happening, in our city where we are now, Emily.
Yeah, I think getting people to think about how are we going to pay to sustain our city. There's a lot of misperceptions about the cost of density, and there's a lot of, multifamily costs more, and that's not always true. So I think you have to dig in a little bit there. But a lot of times, in my experience with different places, even with these bills, the conversation is there's just this opposition to, they don't want multifamily or they don't want density. So even in some of the larger cities, not Dallas, but some others that have the ability to do this, their council's coming out, making it very cost prohibitive for the developers to go in and do these things by requiring crazy dog parks and stuff like that. It's the why behind it. They don't want it, so they're going to, even with the bills, they're going to come up and try to fight it. So there's this tension definitely between, and not just in Texas and other states too, where the states are stepping in, they're seeing an affordability issue. They're seeing now that some of these cities have not passed the codes or the things that are needed at the local level. So now you do have the state inserting themselves, reducing minimum lot size or some of these bills that we're talking here tonight, and there's this battle of local control. You're taking that out of our hands. Well, cities, if you would have done these things to allow this stuff in the first place, the state wouldn't have to get involved. So I think, just a lot of that high level conversation is where I spend a lot of my time in kind of doing the math on different patterns to show that small development, and I can't think of any city that we've ever done work with where the smallest lots had the highest value per acre to the city and were the most affordable for residents. And I'm talking 1,500, 1,000, it's small lots. And that's an eye opener for a lot of people. They see bigger lots as the value. But when you bring the cost part of the equation in, the bigger lots, especially the mid-sized suburban single family stuff that we've been building a ton of, it's an absolute money pit for cities. And so it's either chasing the sales tax that I think Patrick was talking about, or you're trying to get density in some other places to match that. But on the engineering side, my fellow civil engineers out there will always just say, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. That's what they always want to say, we need more money. Where's that money going to come from? The Fed doesn't have it, the states don't have it. We're talking about cities tonight. TxDOT can't pay to maintain everything that they've built. Our water districts can't afford to maintain everything that they've built, but let's go build another reservoir. Let's go build another city out to Oklahoma with more roads and bridges. We can't pay to sustain all of this long term. And so I think that conversation has just become very sticky for us, whether it's a comprehensive plan, if it's a zoning code, if it's a capital improvement program, infrastructure strategies, just getting into what these things really cost and getting the residents to understand that, hey, you might think that when your sidewalk or street falls apart and it needs to be replaced, that your city has money to fix it. They don't. They have money to fix some, but not all of it. And that's a hard conversation to have in cities, but it's one that needs to happen more. They can get that money, but it might require a new fee or raising taxes or allowing density in some places. This conversation tonight, just well-designed density in certain locations around train stations or shopping centers. We co-office with Monty in Wheatland Plaza, and that's just another example of incremental evolution of some of these shopping centers that can become neighborhood nodes that can make those surrounding suburban auto-centric residential areas more walkable, kind of one node at a time. And the benefit of all of that is it's increasing your taxable value, it's providing some affordable units at a gentle density that's not going to add, totally disrupt the surrounding neighborhoods. So most of our work is in those mid-sized, 250,000 all the way down to 10,000 population places. But all of that stuff applies.
I was just saying that shopping center that we're talking about, when it was on the tax rolls for $3 million, that's like $450,000 an acre. I mean, When we get through, it's already up there. It's going to be on the tax rolls for $25 million, $3.5 million per acre. It gets rich. Costco out there, on most Costcos, they're on the tax rolls for around $500,000 an acre. Just to give you, I can tell you that will not pay for the infrastructure. That is a loser. It will not pay.
And before we get to Emily, and then we'll open it up for some questions, you talk about, even when you have money, right, the saying, more money, more problems. If you keep building the same way, sometimes the investment in the long term actually draws away from you, right? Because it's just too costly to maintain. And I'd finally like to say, when we talk about whether it's smaller lots or multifamily, we're talking about neighbors. And I think we often forget that neighborhood, what's the root of neighborhood? It's neighbors, and we forget that it is neighbors that make the neighborhood, and I think we need to get over that a little. Your thoughts quick, and then...
Yeah, and that's, so my wife's a counselor, and we talk a lot about this stuff, conversations at the Shepherd household. They're really fun. But she will say, she talks with a lot of like 10 to 14, 15-year-old kids, and you think just about the way that they're coming up in some of these suburban auto-oriented places, and they don't have the same access to get out and just walk to the park or experience and talk to, the old couple down the street on the front porch, the way I grew up. And the way that we've built these subdivisions, not neighborhoods, is having a real impact on the fiscal and mental health of our kids. That is a very powerful message. I like to talk about the math and the maps and the money and all that, but how we're raising our kids and the kind of environment they're allowed to grow up in, they're subdivisions now. They're not neighborhoods. Popsicle test is the thing I like to bring up just real quick. If you have like an 8-year-old, can they go walk and buy a popsicle and walk home by themselves? If they can't, then you're in a subdivision, not a neighborhood.
So Emily, I know you've got a lot going on that's looking to break down some of these barriers. And if you could include in what you're talking about how folks here might be able to be involved, right? Because there's a public opportunity to have a say in the future of their city. So if you can give us an understanding of what you're looking to do to break down some of these silos, and then how folks might be able to get involved. Floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to talk about two things here. I didn't get a chance to chime in about Senate Bill 840, so I'm going to briefly talk about that. And then I'm talking about this upcoming project, which just got started, the Dallas zoning reform. So those are the two things I'm going to touch on. Senate Bill 840, everybody say it's a game changer. It is a game changer for the state of Texas. 19 cities, but 19 cities in Texas, 10 of them are located in Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, 10 of them. So far, Dallas has been embracing it, working through it, great. But actually, it is game changer. When I first started here, I'm looking at the zoning code, because I'm a planner, I need to know the zoning. I'm really surprised to see the Dallas zoning code is very exclusively, like office only for office, commercials only for commercial, multifamily only for multifamily. It's not very typical, actually. Our peer cities, our competitors, they already allow this called cumulative zoning, means a higher intensity allow low intensity. Office allows multifamily by right. Commercial allows office and multifamily by right, and so on. So they already allowed it by right, but finally, the state passed law. Actually, as a matter of fact, this is something the planner has been talking about for a while, and it was originally scheduled to be included in the Dallas zoning reform, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But the state got this law passed in June. It's really massive. It's helped us because our Dallas zoning reform probably half done now, just because of that. So I would say it not only, the way we interpret it, not only allows multifamily and multifamily mixed use in commercial, retail, office, and even light industrial, it also allows specific standards even though you're currently zoned multifamily, you may not be allowed to build that tall. You may not allowed to build that many units. You may not allow to do certain things. But the standards also very important now in Dallas, because anywhere the highest in density in the city in Dallas is no density. Basically, there's no restriction on density. So everywhere that 840 allows or the multifamily allowed, you can build as many units as you want. And there's also no FAR, floor area ratio. There's no restriction anymore. Those two are gone. The only thing right now we have is a height limit, 45 feet, or the whatever is in that zoning district, you allow it. So the height limit is still 45 feet, or sometime if your zoning district allows 75 will be the higher of the two. So that's tremendous. That's really tremendous. So it's not just about the use, it's also about the density, intensity, and also building height. So I think so far we have a lot of interest. We talk about density, building. So I look at our census information. Dallas population has been flat last few years. Did you notice that? The Metroplex has been growing like crazy. It's 1 year, 180 some people moved into the Metroplex. But city of Dallas population has been flat for the last few years. I mean, even though we continue to build the housing units, one of the reasons is the household size much smaller. If you pick a typical block in the city of Dallas, which I asked one of my staff to help me identify, we look at a typical block, not even going back to the 40s, just going from the 70s to today, the population of a typical building block, the same number of units, the population has been reduced in half. So even though you continue, people say, we have all these units, why do? Yes, it's because people get households smaller. How many of you are single person household? Probably a lot. Used to be 3 or 4 people in a household, but now, so that's one of the reasons we need more housing to support that population growth. So I think Senator 840 probably will help us that. Just last 2 months, we have close to 100 consultations. Basically, if you want to use 840, we encourage you to talk to staff, have a consultation to see how we apply this. We have almost 100 different developers different projects come to us and want to utilize this new law. So I hope, especially with suburban, with all these restrictions, we don't have restrictions now, and hopefully we'll attract more investment in the city of Dallas. The more rooftop, the more people, that will support not only the property tax, but also your retail. Yep. So it's all like connected. So I really agree with everybody saying here. So now we're talking about the zoning reform. Even though it's half done, it's still not done. And I carry this little card with me everywhere we go. It basically tells you, there's a little QR code, DallasZoningReform.com. Get in there, find more information, sign up. You can sign up so you can get informed. You can also submit whatever comment you need. This is very important. As mentioned, the day after Forward Dallas is adopted, we start working on this. We do have a consultant helping us. So there's a lot of background work, research. So earlier this year, in March, the consultant released a diagnostic report. It's just diagnostic saying, basically, what's wrong with your code? There's a lot of things wrong with the code. The number one is outdated. It was developed basically the framework of 1960s. I guarantee only a few people here are even born in the 1960s. That's how old this is. And then that's why we need to update it. It's really, really very confusing. And that's one of the reasons Dallas has 1,200 PDs. PD means Planned Development District, basically means a separate zoning district. So staff basically manage over 1,200 different zoning districts. Can you imagine how hard that is? Can you imagine? Yes, we'll occasionally make a mistake. I always blame the PDs. But anyway, so there's just so all the people trying to get around it. So that's why they created PDs. I'm sure, I heard you have some, hopefully in the future we'll make it clear, just we're clear, future ready, the one that we have is really looking backward. We need something that will really help Dallas to grow in the future. And one of the things we thought, we cannot just use traditional public engagement, because who we are doing all this planning work, who we are doing all these zoning update, it's for the future residents, for the future homeowners. I see a lot of young people. So I really encourage you to be involved, even though you're a renter, because this is for you. You know, a lot of people already own their home, but a lot of people have not. So this is going to take, zoning is law, it's a requirement. It tells what can be built where, what can be built where. Those 5 words talk about zoning. It's very powerful. It tells you what you can, and also tell you what you can't build anything anywhere. So that's very important. We really would like you to be involved. So one of the focus is how we can engage young people, how we can get the future homeowner involved. So I do have the little card here. Before you go, you can just, if you don't want to carry it with you, just scan that, and then you get right into the webpage. We just got that process started. So if you haven't heard about it, that's okay, because we barely got started. So the major engagement is coming up. Right now, we're still collecting a lot of comments, but the first draft, the consultant may release next summer, and we're going to go through intensive public engagement and get comments put together, and then so we can refine that, make sure it got into the final draft. But I do want to say that we talk a lot about things, the parking, the 1 to 8 units, forward dial, all those very important. Anything to be successful, this is my experience based on my 30 years as a planner, you need 3 elements. 1, passionate staff. I do not have any shortage of that. Sometimes I feel like, let's come down a little bit. I'm very passionate, I'm so proud of them. Second one, very important, you need champions as the policymakers. In this case, is your city council member. The third one, supporters from outside. That's very important. I have Brian Tony here. The parking reform, when we did that, we'll hold the public hearing. People come to speak one after another. We have about 100 people spoke, most of them in support. That wasn't always the case. When that happens, it got a very good chance to pass. So passionate staff, champions and lawmakers, and supporters from outside. If you do not have one of those, the timing might not be right. You may have to wait.
Appreciate that, and we could still go for another 10 minutes or so. We'll go a little bit over. This has been a great conversation. I want to know if there are some questions from the audience, and then sort of would love just sort of a 30-second recap from each of you in terms of a final thought. But here, we'll use one of the mics for the audience. There we go.
What reforms need to take place in Texas or North Texas to address what I'll refer to as pseudo-urbanism? When I say pseudo-urbanism, I'm talking about the legacy Wests, the Las Colinas, quote-unquote urban centers, where they apply all of most of the principles we're talking about here, high density, mixed use, elementary and walkable stuff. But they don't address the issues of car dependence, they don't address the issues of sprawl, because these urban centers are in islands, they're not going to fill the neighborhood, they're actively sabotaging or trying to get rid of the mass transit that they have. And so it may solve some issues with regards to sustainable revenue, but they're only exacerbating other issues that good urbanism seeks to resolve. So what reforms do we need to pass in Texas in order to address pseudo-urbanism?
Those are roadside attractions. They're Potemkin villages, effectively. And that's what happens when you have let tens of billions of dollars in highway and road subsidy effectively flatten the real estate market, right? And so there's no longer value in proximity, which is what creates downtown high rises. Well, now we've flattened everything, and so now downtown's emptying out, and the density goes to these little pop-up kind of abstract, make-believe urbanism places where people can drive to and then drive away from, because they're like, oh wow, I like that amenity that I can go to eventually, but I'm not really gonna live there or anything. So it's not that sort of real place. And I think as long as the decision-making processes and the metrics that we use at both a regional and a state level to effectively govern how transportation funding is done. That's saying it doesn't have metrics in terms of, okay, what is the long-term ROI on this? What is the actual efficiency of the transportation movement of this facility? Other states are starting to do that, right? But as long as when I look at the Council of Governments 2045, 2050, all their long-range plans, when you get rid of the 300 some pages of fluff, you find the things that matter and that the 44 people on the RTC look at. It's like, oh, what's the drive time from Dallas to Denton? As if that even matters, right? Like, who does that work for? When we should be saying, how do we get things closer together, right? How do we have more jobs and amenities and destinations near where people live, and not trying to say, well, you know, how do we go from this big red blob if we don't spend money on highways to a slightly less red blob in 30 years, which is just all kind of nonsense at the end of the day. And until we actually have effective metrics that govern how we spend on transportation dollars, that doesn't correct that root problem of how do we reinstill the value of proximity in the real estate market.
Another question. Yes, sir. Here, hold on one moment for the microphone. And as you're bringing that, I will say something. I will say something real quick. I think that there is, if you want to call it a silver lining or whatnot, the attractiveness of those types of places, faux urbanism or not, show that there is a market, that people do want this, right? There's a reason why, okay, urbanism is still better than no urbanism. And then the question is just how do we do that
Yeah, as a quick follow-up, the first projects I worked on were Addison Circle and the first phases of Legacy Town Center at a time when multifamily was verboten in DFW. And then once the city managers saw, oh wow, that's a lot of tax base on a per acre basis, well, we want that too. And so you see Richardson's like, we can't get enough of that kind of stuff too. And so it has changed the mindset, but on the other hand, the quality of work keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse, right? And so like the first phases of Legacy, not Legacy West, you'll see Legacy West all glass and concrete and giant garages. But I would argue that the materials may be cheaper on the original phases of Legacy, but the thoughtfulness of space is much better because they had to be, Like State Thomas was sort of the first foray back in building urbanism in Dallas because a former Dallas Cowboy read Jane Jacobs and was like, why don't people live close to where they work, right? And it was like, okay, well then they wanted to add density.
Who was it? We just learned something tonight.
Robert Shaw.
Who is this Cowboys?
Robert Shaw, former center of the Cowboys in the 80s, brother of my former business partner. But he was proposing to bring in density into State Thomas and Uptown, and the city was like, how do we take these 2-lane roads to 4-lane roads? And he was like, no, that's not what I want to do. We actually want to have walkable neighborhoods with small scale streets. And I gave a talk to AIA 2 years ago, and they said, how has urbanism changed in the last 25 years? I said, we've just gotten worse at everything we've done because we're just cutting corners now.
What I've seen a lot within Dallas and a lot of the cities, when there's plans, whether it's for Dallas 2.0 or the parking reform or anything, a lot of time we see this big push to like, okay, let's do this the right way, the best way, and they're kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it gets kind of watered down. It's still good, but not what the original intent was. But it's still a step forward, right? And so I've heard kind of 2 streams of thought on this. One says you should do that knowing it's going to get watered down. So do like as much as you can, someone's going to water it down, and you'll still make progress. And I've heard another strain of thought is like, if you try to do too much, people are going to freak out because change is scary, and you're going to get nothing done. So I want to know, like, for you guys, when you're going to these high-level things, or it could be low, but what do you think is the best way to make improvements?
That's $1 million question, I tell you. Anybody figured it out? I think different situation you may want, that might be 2 tactics right there. Or you may want to use that differently. Oh, okay.
I mean, first of all, you need to be a lot more incremental developers out there to do it 1 block at a time, 1 house at a time. No, I've never seen anybody that came to town that was going to really do that much good for you You know, we need more local people. We need more local wealth building. We need more people local that own things. That's how you do it. You know, you do it one step at a time.
And Emily, do you want to sort of finish off there in terms of what's your strategy? Are you taking 3 steps forward to go 2 steps forward at the end, or
I think 3 steps forward, 1 step backward, still forward. I think I do agree that incremental changes, incremental progress is still very important. Like the parking reform, for example, we started out with no requirement whatsoever. But when you really look at it, the apartment of 200 units more, whether you said one per unit, whatever, they're still going to provide that because their lenders require. So those are not something critical that bargaining you want to negotiate, right? But the 3 to 20 units, when we negotiate that one, it's very important because these are lower level middle housing, and it may be infill situation. They may not have that parking. So that's very important. I think it's also just like we can talk about that, we also have to really listen to different people. Sometimes, yeah, you ask high, but it's really not, planning is not just always negotiate. That's definitely part of that. But we really have to listen to what people really want and where we're going, and knowing that we may not get there in one phase. The parking reform, for example, we still have more that need to do. We don't have maximum requirement, and we still have certain things we want to clean up later on. But it's a major step forward. I think I think the impact is unbelievable. We talk to a lot of small business owners. They're just so happy. You hate the really the important things, like apartment 200 units, just let it go because they're gonna provide it, lender gonna require. But the small business, that's what we're advocate them for, because they're 200 square feet, bakery. We have so many people come to office and stay in my office for hours and just couldn't figure out how these are the historic building. It's been there for a long time. It was not built for cars, and they want a table in their little bakery. As soon as you put a table, then you kick in this additional requirement. So I think by the end of the day, you really look at, do you meet your goal of helping certain project, 13 people? And I think we did that. And messaging is also important for the parking reform. I keep talking about it because that's the most recent one. Messaging is very important. At first, we're talking about eliminate parking. People just freaking out. Eliminate that word. Oh my God, there's no parking. So we have to re-messaging, and this is something we talk to staff. We have to so eventually we say parking reform for flexibility. We eliminate the word eliminate. So that has really scared a lot of people. I think messaging is really important.
You work in a number of municipalities, so I'd just be curious as your thoughts and some of the lessons learned, both positive and things to avoid.
Well, to respond to his question, I had 2 thoughts popped in my head. One is older cities that are kind of built out and starting to stagnate. I would say incremental all the way. I've seen too many places, Duncanville, DeSoto, places all like that, Garland, that have shopping centers, and their economic development people are like, we're gonna wait, we're gonna get that big developer, they're gonna come here, they're gonna scrape, redevelop, give us the big thing, or get the Trader Joe's or whatever it is, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And they keep thinking they can compete with the Friscos or the Prospers or downtown Dallas's even, right? And they wait. Meanwhile, those places stagnate, they start to drop on the tax rolls, they start to impact the neighborhoods around them. So in more established kind of places, I think incremental, absolutely, at every context, to Emily's point and Patrick and Monty, I think you just have to activate and get things going. Where I take a really strong stand is in newer communities of, you're either gonna build a place that's fiscally and affordable, or fiscally maintained, sustainable and affordable long-term, or you're not. And so for us, for our company, we draw, if you wanna be kind of another fast-growing suburb that's gonna do all of the kind of the faux urbanism kind of stuff, that's not the places we want to work. If you really want to try to lay out a plan and build and grow in a way that is going to be sustainable and affordable long term, then we'll help you. But yeah, the incremental stuff, there's just too many people that they say, oh, well, this version's not the shiny new or the best thing that we could get. And, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And then to Emily's point, it's not just Dallas. There's so many cities that there's just little silly requirements that keep a really great project from happening. And it would be nice to have, the staff that have the, the ability and capability to just, work with folks and let things happen. So, I've worked with Monty a long time, and this guy comes in with great ideas all the time, and they can't happen because of something just really, really silly. The last thing I want to say is for regional, all of this to Patrick's point, right? We have all these people moving to Dallas and to the region. We have plenty of capacity with all of the infrastructure and the transit that we've already built. We don't need to go build a whole bunch of additional infrastructure to handle these people, and we can't. So we gotta bring the people back into the core and back into Dallas, and these bills are a really good first step.
Patrick, and then
Yeah.
we'll take one more quick
I
one.
just
but
want to
please.
add one thing that's
That was
going
my
under the
parting shot,
radar
so.
related to housing, city building policy and all that, and that's fall elections. And we talk about, do we do things incrementally? What puts jet fuel behind everything is voter turnout. And Emily is responsive to council people who are responsive to, theoretically, their 90 to 100,000 people they represent, but some of them are put in there by 600 people. We've got the lowest voter turnout of any major city in the country. We've got a median age of like 35. You know what the median voter age is in Dallas? 62.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, 62. It is the oldest in the country. And we're 40% renter right now. And so guess how many, 60% renter, 40% homeowner. So
Oh, people.
the big thing is, so Austin went to fall elections. They've had 2 cycles now of going to very YIMBY councils, and they now have the most aggressive housing policies in the entire country. So one way to go from, we'll just take wins where we can get them, is changing our elections, right? Having more voter turnout, having more representation. And I think that's something that's going to change, potentially, fingers crossed, change a lot in the city.
I think that's a great sort of couple of closing thoughts. Why don't we go into Monty, if you have any last sort of comments to say, and then Emily, and then we'll wrap up. We're happy to converse with you all afterward, and after that, I know Pete has some closing remarks.
So I'm gonna throw a bomb in here because, nothing I say is absolute. I'm really worried about this apartment on every retail and every industrial place because I can just see our future slums being built. This going unchecked to me is really dangerous. And because I've seen some really crappy stuff get built in southern Dallas County. And that really worries me a lot, that we're just gonna let, that's the thing about Dallas that always gets me. We go from one, and not just Dallas, but a lot, but so we go from this thing all the way over to here. And so there's no ever incremental change. Do we ever tweak, do we tweak these things and get them? I'm just so worried. In South Dallas, I'm really worried about what it's gonna do to us.
I appreciate that counterpoint.
My final thing, get involved. Dallas don't need reform. I have the card.
Get a card.
We can only be successful if we have enough supporters from you all.
And contact your council person. So let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. That was awesome.